Good morning. Welcome to this, hello, good morning. Welcome to this first session of today. This is the second one. It is entitled The Enabling Environment for Media Pluralism in Europe. The question here is how to act on the media pluralism structural challenges. The session fits with the Mediatem project. As you may know, I'm a member of the Spanish team. This project is entitled European Media Policies Revisited, Valuing and Reclaiming Free and Independent Media in Contemporary Democracy Systems. We analyzed 12 countries and 2 European candidate countries, and we think it's a nice time to analyze how media can spread democracy. I think we all agree that we have enough media freedom if we focus on editorial freedom from government influence. There's no direct censor, okay. But media freedom is a bit more complex. For example, we can see the case of the media ownership. There's a big interventionist stance. There's a lot of public intervention in how the industry works. There's also, let's say, a monopoly of media companies based on for-profit goals. On the second hand, there's the question of the media finance. We are facing the perfect storm. We see the decline of the advertisement industry as well as the lack of a new business model. We don't know how to go to this digital world. Third, we see this relation between media and politics. Yesterday we demand accountability and transparency. And I agree totally, because as far as our elections are based on a market-driven process, we need to know more. We need more detail in order to assess the policies, the politics, and also the people who is in charge of these policies. And fourth, we have to know something more about the digital and the online environment. Here I would like to remember you a nice concept, the so-called zombies. I'm sure you know it. We are dead and we don't know it. Why? Because we yesterday, and maybe today, we were talking about media companies, law, because we use these categories and institutions as we used to know. But we face a total change. We are just in the first step of this declining influence model. There's no longer this big media, there's no longer these big institutions. I think we are facing this new project, new small media, new social media. We don't know too much how will they be in the future. So, today we will speak about several things. I have some questions for my colleagues. I will post these questions now just to bear in mind and just to provoke some first impressions in your presentations. The first one is related to the role of the public service broadcast. Do we have enough public service broadcast? Do we need more public service media, much more than public service broadcasters? The second one is related to the law. Do we need co-regulation, self-regulation, no regulation, regulation? I don't know. The third one is related to accountability and transparency. We need much more media literacy. Can we avoid this structural change with more media literacy? The fourth point is probably my favorite, because I'm a journalist. What about the situation of the journalist? Can we demand more structural pluralism if we have this bad situation, this professional situation of journalists? And the fifth point is, please, can you give us some best practices? Do you have the keys? So, the first people I would like to introduce you is Peggy Balka. She's research professor at the Catholic University of Louvain, where she currently heads the Interdisciplinary Center for Law and ICT at the Faculty of Law. She's also visiting professor at the University of Tilburg and teaches media law at the University of Brussels and in the Florence School of Regulation. She's a leading European expert on media and communications law, and she was recently appointed a member of the scientific committee for the new Center of Media Freedom and Pluralism here at the Institute. Also, she is member of the General Chamber in the Flemish Media Regulator and the Belgian Competition Council. So, Peggy.
Thank you very much, Juan Luis. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to present to you a study that we've been carrying out for the European Commission in 2008-2009 with the objective of developing a measurement tool for media pluralism in Europe. Now, I usually talk about this for 1 hour, and I've been told that I have like 7 minutes. So I'll do my best to give you a flavor of what we did, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions afterwards. This doesn't work, so I'll do it. Okay. So far, yeah, I have 6 minutes left, so what can we do? While someone is coming over, I'll just start with the short introduction. I wanted to highlight that assigning this study was not the first initiative that the European Commission took in the area of media pluralism. Many people in the room will undoubtedly remember that in the 90s, the European Commission tried to come up with legislation in the area of media ownership, which, however, failed. Showing the political sensitivity of the issue. And so for many years it remained silent. The European Parliament, though, kept urging the European Commission to take an initiative. And so in 2007, the so-called three-step approach was launched by then Commissioners Reding and Wallström. The first step constituted of a Commission staff working document giving an overview of the situation, the media landscapes and the actors active on the markets in the member states, and also stressing the importance of transparency. So the idea of monitoring and developing a monitoring tool for media pluralism was put forward in that document. And the second step was the study that we carried out. And the initial idea was to have a third step also, a communication, highlighting certain indicators that member states would then ideally have to implement in their own countries, but that communication has been abandoned due to the change of the mandate of the European Commission. So I'm going to give you a flavor of the study and the outcome of the study that we did. The objective was to develop, as you can read on the slide, a practicable monitoring tool that could detect threats to pluralism with differentiated sets of indicators covering legal, economic and socio-cultural considerations. And this tool should then provide evidence flowing into or underpinning policies. So it was not about harmonizing policies or regulation throughout Europe. It was to provide evidence and have more transparency. So it's about diagnosis and not about therapy. I'd like to use this image of a thermometer, so a tool that can take the temperature of the media landscapes in the member states. But this tool that we developed is not about predicting any policies or harmonizing policies. So we worked on this study with, I would call, a dream team of media economists, media scholars, lawyers, and risk experts, more than 50 people in total. We also had country experts in all the member states, and then a quality control team of people outside the EU. It's too small to read, but I'm happy to pass on the report and also the manual for your information. You can flip through it while I'm presenting this or giving this presentation. We started from a very broad notion of media pluralism in our study, following descriptions by the Council of Europe, but also the European Commission in its Commission Staff Working Document of 2007. So looking at ownership issues, looking at cultural aspects, political diversity, geographic diversity, etc. And so the outcome is a tool built in Microsoft Excel that contains in total 166 indicators that you can score, and then I will show you how the result looks like. It's like a rose with green, orange, and red zones, and you can immediately see where the problems lie in the country, if, of course, you would implement the tool. Now, what are the underlying or the underlying principles for this tool? Well, first of all, the Commission stressed that we had to come up with a neutral monitoring tool which would be compatible with the different normative approaches and the diverging regulatory cultures in the EU. So when we look at regulation, for instance, we look at both state, in legal indicators, we do take into account state legislation, but also self-regulatory measures, because in certain member states, this is the way to approach a problem. The tool also had to be comprehensive. It had to look at the various segments of the media market, so both print, audiovisual, online, public media, private media, and also community media. And what we think is innovative about this tool is that for the first time it brings together these different facets in a systematic way. You have systems in member states that look into ownership, concentration issues. There are tools now that, for instance, measure independence of media regulators, also commissioned by the European Commission. But we try to bring together these different aspects in one tool. It's a risk-based tool, which means that it's not looking for best practices, it's not assessing an actual level of media diversity, but it looks at threats to media pluralism. Now, we've been criticized for not taking into account opportunities like the rollout of broadband. Well, we do take that into account, but we have formulated it under a threat, in the sense that we have an indicator looking at low availability of broadband networks in rural areas as an alternative to traditional distribution means. So it is included, but it's formulated as a threat. The tool also had to be as objective and concrete as possible, so we've tried to rely on quantitative measurements as much as possible. And we have, and this is also being distributed now, a very extensive manual on explaining the methods that underpin the tool, also the border values that we have used to indicate the dangerous zones and the safe zones. So we've tried to create the largest possible level of transparency. It's also an EU standardized tool, and we've had intense discussions on should we develop different indicators for different country profiles? But in the end, we decided to come up with a common set of indicators and border values for the EU member states in order to avoid manipulation. And there are two mechanisms in the tool. We call this the ex-ante and ex-post profiling function in the tool that enables you to take into account national specificities. Whether the market is large or small, wealthy or poorer, it does make a difference in terms of number of media companies, the level of diversity that you can sustain. And it's also an evolving tool in the sense that it's pretty easy to take out indicators which may have become outdated over a period of time and include new ones, looking more into new media, for instance. If you want, I can explain in more detail the SMART test that we applied to select the indicators, but I will skip it for time reasons. It also, and that's the final characteristic, it had to be very user-friendly, and that is why we tried to make it very visual. I will show you in a moment how the Excel works. We've also developed this detailed user guide, and it had to be open for a wide range of stakeholders to use. That's what the Commission stressed. So this is how it looks like. In Excel, you have on the left-hand side entries to score sheets, on the right-hand side entries to result sheets, and we have identified 6 domains. We look at ownership issues, looking at concentration in terrestrial TV, newspaper markets, also online content provision. We look at pluralism of media types and genres, political pluralism in the media, cultural pluralism, geographical pluralism, and then what we call a basic domain, which contains a number of indicators on safeguards for freedom of expression, independence of media regulators, and the level of media literacy. So in these domains, we identified threats, risks that are then measured, through 3 types of indicators. Legal indicators, looking at the regulatory context. Are there regulatory safeguards out there, and are they effectively implemented? Socio-demographic indicators, looking at social, geographic, demographic factors which may have an impact on media pluralism, and then economic indicators, so looking at ownership issues, the industry structure, the revenue distribution between public and private media, and so on. These indicators cover 3 risk areas: supply, distribution, use. So we have included these 3 areas in the tool, and they are scored on the basis of 3 border values. There's a red zone, orange zone, or green zone. Let me explain you how it works in practice. So this is a score sheet. This is an indicator in the domain media pluralism of types and genres. And the first indicator there is audience parity between the TV channels of commercial broadcasters and public service media. So in the manual, it's explained how you need to score the indicator, and then you fill out the result, and you will immediately see whether you are in the green or orange or red zone. And if you have scored all the indicators, this is what you get, this very nice rows, indicating for which indicators you may have a serious problem, the red zone, a medium risk, orange, or where you are safe, the green zone. And there are different roses depending on the detail, the level of detail, whether you want average scores or whether you want the detailed scores for the indicators. Now, what do you do with these roses? Once you have scored different indicators, you need to interpret the results, and we've also included in the manual guidelines for interpretation, taking into account certain national specificities, how large is the market, and so on. And you can also take into account 2 characteristics of your market, so how large is your market, how wealthy is your market, GDP per capita, in advance. And this is the last thing I'm going to explain. So if this is an option. For those using the tool, if they want, they can select, before starting to score the indicators, whether their country has a large or a small population, and whether the GDP per capita is high or small, and the numbers are in the manual to know what is large, what is small. And then that has an impact on the thresholds for certain indicators, especially economic indicators relating to concentration. And so the smaller your market is, the higher your concentration level can be before you enter the dangerous zone. Basically, that's what it's about. Now, you're going to ask me, what happened with this tool? Well, it's out there in the public domain. You can download it. You can consult it on the website of the European Commission. But although initially follow-up studies had been envisaged, no follow-up studies have actually been assigned so far by the European Commission. There was no budget secured so far. And to my knowledge, no one has ever systematically implemented the tool. There was a kind of pilot test by AGECOM, the Italian regulator, in the summer of 2009. And people are undoubtedly experimenting with it. I did some experiments with students, but so far no one ever systematically implemented the tool throughout the EU. And we're still looking forward to have that opportunity one day, either the people who develop the tool or other people, as long as it's used, we would be very happy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Now, Mark Thompson will speak about the findings of a global research project that the media program is running. The project is the Mapping Digital Media. You have some examples outside. This project looks at the impact of the new and digital media on the production and the consumption of news in more than 50 countries. Mark is the reports editor at the Open Society Media Program in London. Before joining the Open Society, he worked as a media consultant for various government and non-government organizations, and also for missions and the United Nations. He has also been a journalist. I think we are always journalists. Once a journalist, always a journalist. So, Mark, it's your time.
Thanks very much, Juan Luis. I'll do my best to speak for less than 7 minutes, although I'm not making a promise. What I'm going to tell you about in these few moments is a research project that is still very much in medias res. And all I can try to do now is sketch the project for you and give you a flavor of the findings, the provisional findings, I should say, that we've collected so far. I thought it was a complicated project, but compared to Peggy's indicators, it seems simple enough, although quite complex enough for us to be running. The MDM project is looking at the impact of digitization and new media on the production and consumption of news in 50 to 55 countries. I think we'll end up with a number between then, around the world, covering all the dark parts of the map here. Now, it's thematically as well as geographically ambitious because it seems to us the only way to try and catch the impact of such extensive and interconnected changes, what Juan Luis rightly called total change, is to look simultaneously at developments in journalism, in ownership and business models, in policy laws and regulations. Sorry, those are the countries, but there's no point in trying to go through those now. These are the topics. Journalism, ownership and business models, in policy, laws and regulations, in patterns of access and consumption, in the trends of user-generated content, news on social media, in the treatment of socially sensitive issues, and online activism, more as well, I dare say. And in the ways that public, or in some countries still state media, are or aren't keeping up. We've published 17 or 18 reports. I think the 18th should be online today. Some of these are available on the table outside. I'm glad that you've been helping yourselves. Do please continue to do so. We'd be sorry to take any home again. So in terms of pluralism, clearly lots of the fields that we're looking at touch on pluralism. Let me just try and highlight a very few of the trends that emerge from our sample findings from about 30 countries. We have results in from about 30 countries. And I think some of these highlights may touch on some of Juan Luis's 5 questions. So, very, very briefly. In terms of public service media, the essential story that we are getting so far is that in most places they have been missing the boat. There are exceptions, nowhere more so than in the UK, but the broad picture, and it isn't after all a surprising one, is of institutions that were unprepared and often also unequipped to take the leap that was needed during the past decade to establish a strong presence on online platforms. And which have treated switchover as an unpleasant necessity rather than an opportunity. In terms of socially sensitive issues, which of course touches on diversity, which we were discussing yesterday, we see almost everywhere how disadvantaged groups are now better able to communicate internally and to present themselves to society at large, and that this makes a very positive difference. The only exception in our sample countries so far to this beneficial trend was found in parts of former Yugoslavia. What isn't clear is whether the mainstream media coverage of these groups and their concerns is altering at anything like the same positive pace, but that is harder to establish anyway, and perhaps our project comes too soon for that. In terms of ownership, we find concentration and consolidation trends are certainly there, as would be expected, and cross-ownership emerging really as the most important dynamic, and perhaps still an under-researched one. In terms of overall news diversity and journalism standards, our reporters, and let me add at this point, they all come from the countries they report on. They're all local teams, not international experts parachuted in. Our reporters mostly discover a broadened range of news sources and of information. The opportunities for online research and access are significant, making a positive difference to journalism. But at the same time, there are very widespread concerns, as you'll see on the slide there, about the effect of increased commercial pressures, which, as Aidan explained eloquently yesterday, so easily erodes the conditions in which serious journalism can be done. So concerns about so-called churnalism and flat earth news are very much present. As for social networks, becoming incredibly important platforms for disseminating news, that's another under-researched area. But it's clear to us from our findings that social networks are not generating professionally edited news themselves, and this is important. In terms of markets, we see the great power of the incumbents, the incumbent operators, and how in some countries they are helped politically to exclude new entrants and to seal markets, really. Major new providers of serious online news are almost as rare as hen's teeth. The landscape of ownership is not changing radically. Groupings which are more political and business in nature remain very influential. What we don't see is telecoms companies moving en masse into media ownership. That trend, which is much rumored, it turns out to be an urban myth, at least in our project findings. Finally, we see an important trend in terms of increased government spending on media, overt, covert, via advertising or direct budget allocation. And given the crisis facing journalism, facing media, it's easy to see why this is happening, and it might even be positive for pluralism, but historically, of course, it would be naive to ignore the possibility that it may not be positive for very long, or not remain so. Let me stop there and confess that these summary points do not do justice to these reports, which are very rich, and I think that their interest lies in the detailed analyses and interdisciplinary linkages which they tease out and explain. And there will be a comparative stage of this project, and the full comparative analysis of the project findings, for obvious reasons, has only just begun. And it won't begin to be published in, I think, several waves until the end of the year. So may I finally encourage you to pick up those last reports outside and to follow the project on the two websites shown, if I can get through. This is slides which there is no time. There we go. The two websites shown on the slide there, where all the publications in this project are shown, and also some background material. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. It has been really interesting. Now it's time to listen to Amy Gouillet. She's from the Central European University. She comes from the Center for Media and Communication Studies, and she will explain the specific case of the Hungarian media law in the European context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is this on? Can you hear it? Is this, okay. So I would like to focus on the issue of Hungary, as I think it's an important case study of the issues with regard to media pluralism. I think there are sort of two contexts or layers to looking at media pluralism in Hungary. The first is, of course, the formal legal context, and in particular, the new media regulation system that was introduced in 2010, which is having a profound impact on pluralism in Hungary. And the other is sort of the broader media landscape. Excuse me. And the other is the broader media landscape, which I can go into in more detail, that has limited the emergence of independent media in Hungary. So for the first point, which is about the legislative or formal structure, which was introduced by the new media laws in 2010, just briefly, the laws introduced a new comprehensive regulatory regime that covers all media sectors under the oversight of a single body. And what I would like to focus on one aspect in particular is the Media Council's control over tendering and licensing. Under the new system, the Media Council controls all areas of licensing, from issuing tenders to awarding licenses, both for analog and digital. So the law also gives the Media Council rather wide discretionary powers over this process. Just quickly, the Media Council can issue tender notices for frequencies that define the conditions and criteria for these stations, as was the recent case with Club Radio. The law also grants the Media Council the discretion to allocate frequencies without a competitive tender process. And two different provisions of the law allows this, gives the Media Council these powers. And then finally, the law also grants the Media Council the discretion to amend the terms of the licenses and to expand the transmission area of the frequencies once the contracts are awarded. And this is important because they in fact just recently did this with a local radio station. So with regards to the Media Council's frequency allocation practices so far, in the first 18 months of its mandate, the Council distributed 35 local frequencies, 18 of which have been given to 4 companies which are on the right side of the political spectrum, and some that have direct ties with the government. In particular, one local radio station is called Lánchíd Radio, which has a minuscule market share, but actually is a rather large player in the media market. A set of its editors were just named to run Hungary's public media system. So with regard to that decision, the Media Council actually just expanded the broadcasting reach of these 4 local stations that Lánchíd was awarded in a way that their broadcasting reach now reaches from Budapest throughout Western Hungary. So essentially, these local licenses became regional licenses without a public tender process. And moving to the second point, which is about the media landscape in Hungary, which I think helps frame the broader picture and illuminates the challenges of media pluralism in Hungary. More specifically, the very small size of Hungary's media market in comparison to many other European states, which has created an intense competition between political elites and private companies over extremely limited resources. So this has created a very politically polarized media landscape in the news media, and on one hand, and a very overly commercialized broadcast sector on the other, and there's very little or no independent traditional media. So this is where the public media would normally play a very key role to sort of step in and provide a balance to the deficits of the media landscape. However, under the current situation, the Media Council actually has direct and indirect control over the public media system. And without getting into it, because there's lots of details, but in essence, the public media system has been centralized under a single board, and all of the news is created by a single outlet, which is distributed to all of the other public media outlets. And it's also picked up by commercial outlets as well, because it's offered for free. So it seems as though the new public media system has actually become a great threat to media pluralism in Hungary rather than a solution to the problems that exist in the commercial sector. So the most independent media in Hungary is now found on the internet with a few large and rather successful news portals that provide relatively independent news, and they become a hub of investigative reporting. However, these are not traditional outlets, so this excludes a very large audience of mostly older Hungarians who still rely primarily on traditional broadcasting. And I think I'll just stop there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. So in the future questions, you will have an extra minute.
Oh, okay.
So now it's time for Bea Bodrogi. She's a lawyer, and she has been working for 15 years as legal counsel before Hungarian and international courts. Now she's working on a new project in 3 areas. The first one is providing legal representation for journalists. The second one is to taking cases to the Hungarian Media Authority, and I missed the third one, so sorry. Bea, it's your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to talk about our pilot project from a very practical point of view, and to show how our NGO is trying to contribute to bringing content pluralism to the Hungarian media through legal ways. First of all, I want to clarify what we mean by political content pluralism and how this is defined by the current Hungarian legislation. The law says that in news and informative programming, the media must provide information in a way that shows the various sides of an issue and in a way that is factually accurate, timely, objective, and balanced. These requirements taken together are what is called balanced coverage. If the content provider fails to meet these criteria, legal administrative measures can be taken against it. Through the administrative proceedings, it can be requested, through administrative proceedings, it can be requested that the content provider present the other side of the story that were not heard, or that is published a certain statement. We will be testing this legal recourse within the framework of our project. It's important to say that we do not deal with balanced coverage with respect to political parties. Instead, we only take action with regard to those groups that suffer from the most prejudice in Hungary. Roma members of LGBT community, migrants, and the Jewish community. We will only be monitoring the public service broadcast media, and accordingly we only launch administrative proceedings in cases where we find unbalanced coverage in the public service media. We do not cover online and print media. In short, I would like to talk about why and what justifies these proceedings. Why does Hungary need this, and why now? On one hand, the political climate has changed into one which favors the exclusion of disadvantaged groups and to generating attitudes of prejudice towards them. The result of all this is that the expression gypsy crime has been introduced and accepted in the public speech as well. Another typical example is that it is now a widely accepted view that certain groups, like homeless people, the poor, or Roma, are themselves solely responsible for their situation. So scapegoating has become an accepted practice. And politicians are either silent on this issue or actively contribute to this. The media have also played an active part in altering the public mood and discourse in Hungary. Although the media does report on events or specific cases I have mentioned, the coverage often doesn't seek to reveal the actual problems. Instead, reports are superficial, one-sided, and contribute to promoting the current prejudices. We see that in the leading broadcast media, subtle forms of viewer manipulation are used, like showing pluralism as deviance, reinforcing stereotypes, and confirming scapegoating. As a lawyer, I'm concerned that it is not the state who should be responsible for dealing with these issues or with this problem. This is a complex issue, as we have already talked yesterday. In those countries where the media are governed by an effective self-regulation system, this type of cases would be dealt within the context of self-regulation. In Hungary, the media doesn't yet have any effective system of self-regulation, although a few hopeful initiatives have been launched recently and an independent code of ethics has been drafted. So what are the aims of the test proceedings? First, to ensure that some measures are taken in response to highly prejudiced and manipulative programming, and that there is some consequences to it. And second, through our cases, we would like to give substantial content to the concept of balanced coverage to show what pluralism, factual accuracy, timeliness, and objectivity really mean in a unique and specific case. We've been running this project for 4 months now, and it's not surprising that all cases, we have taken 3 cases so far, concern only the Roma issue. We claim that editorial freedom doesn't give the right to make programming that shows a certain group exclusively in a stereotyped manner, and thus portrays reality in an unrealistic way. What we see is that journalists, whether deliberately or because of lack of training, play on these stereotypes and use them to paint a distorted picture of certain social issues. This happened in a recent case. 2 weeks ago, there was a documentary film in the state-owned and state-funded public service TV channel. And the documentary was about the coexistence of Gypsies and Hungarians. The message of this 1-hour documentary film was that the Roma are solely responsible for their own problems, and they need to change and ask for forgiveness of the society. And this nonsense viewpoint was legitimized by the fact that these words are only put in the mouths of Roma people. To show, the show ends with all the Roma interviewed asking for forgiveness for the sins committed against the Hungarians in the name of all Roma. Let me show you a few seconds of the documentary.
A cigány ember, megmondom nektek, hogy nagyon nehéz ma Magyarországon a cigányokkal együtt élni rengeteg településen.
Nemzetem nevébe, mint keresztény lelkipásztor, hogy kérjek bocsánatot a magyar nemzettől. Azokért a bűnökért, amit elkövettünk a magyar nép ellen, mint romák.
So what we did after this documentary film took place in the public service media, in the state-owned media, we addressed, or we turned to the TV channel and requested to publish our statement that their program had shown an unbalanced coverage. And we also said which important sides to the story had been left out in their presentation of the story. We haven't received any reply from the TV channel, and according to the procedural rules, we went to the Media Council and requested this, asked the same request. This film has generated a lot of indignation from the Hungarian civil society. A petition has collected 1,400 signatures, critical editorials have been published, and other legal proceedings have also been launched in the matter. As a result, or we don't know why, but the TV channel has decided not to air the disputed program again, as it had originally planned. And as to the conclusion, I have tried to convey in my presentation that in Hungary, prejudice towards disadvantaged groups is a serious social problem. Over the last few years, however, things got even worse. Racially motivated murders, the creation of fascist paramilitary groups that have marched into villages and terrorized certain groups, and on top all of this, the media only further reinforce this social tension. As I said earlier, I believe that in a stable democracy, legislation should play only a minimum role in this area, and that journalists should be entrusted with setting up their own regulatory system. Until then, the legal system can play its own small and minimum role, because I think Hungary is in the last hour. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It has been amazing. Now it's time for questions or answers. Who wants to start? Okay. 1, 2.
Well, I'm not sure it's actually a question. It's rather a comment, but I would address this comment to all Hungarian participants or participants representing the Hungarian issue today, so including perhaps Professor Peter Molnar. And well, the comment has something to do with my own research. Well, part of my research on freedom of speech dealt also with the case studies in Central and Eastern Europe. I do speak Polish and Czech, so that's motivated the choice of those countries. And I added Hungary for two reasons. First, because it has, well, definitely a very specific approach towards hate speech as far as the decisions of the Constitutional Court at least are concerned. And secondly, due to the wonderful Hungarian scholarship, amongst others represented by Peter Molnar, so with really plenty of literature available in English, and luckily most of the decisions, or all the decisions actually of the Constitutional Court, brilliantly translated into English, which definitely facilitated the research. But one thing I found striking, that's why it's a comment, because your presentation was not directly dealing with hate speech, although affecting it, it was more about media law and changes in media law, is that whenever I meet Hungarian scholars, the more progressive, more liberal they are, the more pro-protective they are as far as the realm of constitutional decisions in Hungary is concerned. For those of you who perhaps are not very much aware of the constitutional model on hate speech developed in Hungary, it's a very specific model which tries to marry two approaches. The communist 1978 Criminal Code of Hungary classified hate speech as the crime against the state, so it was reformulated. Now it's the crime against the peace, as elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. And, well, basically the hate speech constructions was lifted towards something like incitement, yeah, so that l'incitation, which is, we actually encounter in many other continental criminal codes, and there is nothing very much original about Article 265. But what was there originally that there were 4 or 5 attempts by the Constitutional Court to actually revision, yeah, and those attempts were motivated by the parliamentary group's request, saying that, well, but just that mere formulation of incitement doesn't motivate the courts to actually prosecute the haters. Yeah? So Hungary represents definitely the worst case in terms of actual prosecution of hatred groups. It makes, well, the ping-pong between the parliament and constitutional Hungary, which we've observed in 10 years, made virtually impossible any prosecution by courts or prosecutors, because the whole issue becomes esoteric. The courts say, well, but in the absence of the definition from the Hungarian court, and, well, which very strangely understands American model, because they, with following the clear and present dangerous taste and content restriction as described by Peter Molnar yesterday, we would fall in a completely different model. Moreover, I'm not sure that in 1992, when the first Hungarian decision came into force, well, most of the judges were acquainted very good with the American model. I think it was the Scholem, yeah, the first or second, it was the first, I think, president of Hungarian court who once confessed that most of the judges of the Hungarian Constitutional Court in the 90s didn't speak English. Well, they were all Humboldt fellows in Germany, so it was Volksverhetzung, yeah, the way they understood it, it was incitement, but they were not willing to extend it. So my question is, with regard to media law, and I pretty much agree with all the criticism, and I find the Fidesz reforms and the new constitutional project absolutely yeah, unacceptable. I totally agree with the conclusions of the Venice report criticism on the new Hungarian media law. Unfortunately, I have to constatate that Hungary is moving in the direction of Belarus, so basically limiting freedom of expression, and that's very unfortunate. But don't you also think that that extremely liberal, if not libertarian, Hungarian constitutional model of, as far as hate speech, yeah, the main theme about conference, has actually brought to the situation of the race of radical right, because the idea of having those criminal clauses, even if not effective, in criminal codes in Central and Eastern Europe was that there's streitbare democracy, militant democracy. The idea that, well, Hitler also came to power in a pretty democratic way. So did Viktor Orban. Thank you very much.
Aidan, please.
Yeah, I mean, my question is absolutely miles away from that, so I don't know whether you want to sort of deal with it. I want to sort of deal with a really sort of practical question, which is, I think you were outlining in the questions you put at the outset, which is, you know, there are sort of very severe questions facing in practical terms and in realistic terms the social, professional, economic realities of how media operate and how journalism is practiced in Europe at this moment, and how do we address those problems? I mean, I'm very interested to hear from the panelists and researchers answers to the question about, within the media there is a sort of a narrative which is a very depressing and negative narrative about the future and so on. The argument tends to boil down to, do we have paywalls or don't we have paywalls in terms of, you know, of addressing the future? And it's very much a sort of economically cutting narrative with very little investment in the future. And so there's a major question about that. So how does one change that? And that's part of the process of engaging media themselves in this debate and discussion. I'd like to ask particularly Mark about the research. I mean, I think this research is extremely interesting and very useful, the digital project. But how, for example, I mean, how do you see the evolution, for instance, of the notion of public service value? You did earlier research on public service media in the region. How does that tie in with the findings with that research which you did? I mean, and have you identified any models of a redefined public service landscape for public investment in media and journalism for the future? And it seems to me that that's a critical question. And also, I wanted to ask about Peggy about the sort of what appears to be your disappointment and the failure of your research. I mean, have you reflected on exactly, perhaps, does it need to be redone, reevaluated? I mean, do you find that the problem related to the concern about broadband and the lack of taking into consideration the impact of digital changes has actually undermined the value and the interest in the research, and therefore have you another view about how to maybe do that again?
Let's listen to the questions before we answer. Miklos, please.
I'm afraid it's two short answers to two questions that have been raised here, and even if I'm not an official answer, but the Hungarian in me wants to comment on the pluralism issue and going back to the hate speech issue that was raised. Pluralism. The most important similarity between post-Soviet realities, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, whatever, and present-day Hungary is the fact that broadcasting is fully a governmental information monopoly. Just like in these countries that I mentioned, in present-day Hungary, whether privately owned, whether called state television or called public service television, broadcasting is firmly in governmental hands or in the hands of cronies or relatives of government. And there are only two choices in broadcasting in these countries, including Hungary. One is politicized propaganda channels. Typically the state or public service channels are like this, but many of the privately owned as well. If they are calling themselves or see their own vocation in news, in public information, in public life, or mad entertainment without any news value. There is no middle road, there is no third road, and either this way or the other way, they are in the hands of the government. In terms of information monopoly, I stress because some of these countries do comply with ownership demonopolization rules, but not in terms of information. This is my first comment, and this is the most important similarity, much more important than anything else, and it amounts to a new type of censorship, seemingly complying with rule of law, seemingly complying with parliament-led procedures, and many times even cynically referring to European values in the laws. So this is very important. Pluralism is the name of the game in this new post-dictatorial, quasi-democratic, quasi-rule of law type of censorship. My second comment is, yes, your observation is right, but your lesson driven from it is, I believe, wrong. It has nothing to do with the fact that the constitutional jurisprudence of Hungary has been consistently developed until today. We haven't seen yet the new constitutional court's changes brought to the jurisprudence, but until today, yes. It was a typically First Amendment-driven, minimal intrusion, kind of test, as Peter put it, test immediate dangers and only act if you have. But the laws were there. These were clearly demarked cases where you have to act. And there have been, you are right, many cases in front of judges when they could have acted on the existing kind of limitations of free speech, and they did not. And it has nothing to do with the constitutional jurisdiction. The tools were in their hands. It has nothing to do with the fact that they speak German but they don't speak English, because they didn't even read the Hungarian constitutional jurisprudence, not talking about the English text. It has to do with the political setup of Hungary that led to the present day situation. The middle right, the so-called center right in Hungary for the last 15 years has been always open to the right and close to the left, has always criticized every step that would have gone against far-right perpetrators, far-right hate speakers, as attempt against freedom of speech, without any actual reference to the existent laws. And the judges, in a quite understandable way in a post-communist country, have escaped into referring to the constitutional in a fake way, to the constitutional jurisprudence. In fact, they were afraid that if they pass, some of them were actual judges who already had served under communism. They were afraid if they, after decades of communism, they will be the ones who start limiting speech in democracy, they will be accused of being political by the right, by the united right-wing spectrum of Hungary. So it was simply the luck of the normal center-right line. You can call it the Chirac line, or you can call it the... In any established democracy, there is a clear demarcation line to the far right. You are not calling upon the far-right voters, come to us, we are defending your values. The public life is not full of buzzwords emanated to the far-right in order to recruit them to the so-called center-right party. So it is not frightening for judges to take the normal position and use the existent laws. And it has become a both national and international urban legend that this situation is because of the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. No, it is because the judges, because of the political setup of Hungary, have been afraid to use the existent laws at hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, please.
Thanks. So to continue where Miklós finished, the bottom line is that we are talking about the culture of our countries, not culture not in the sense of art, but in the culture of how people live in our countries, and that's what we need to improve in order, otherwise we cannot have better media policies. If a country, as Bea mentioned, is suffering from ignorance and prejudices in relation to all sorts of minorities, then there is little hope to fight so-called hate speech. But as this is just a short comment, and I have a short question in which I try to connect the problem in Hungary to the European policies on media pluralism. And so I think that, to start with a critical statement of all of us in Europe, I think what's happening in Hungary, the Putinization of the media system in Hungary, which of course goes against both pluralism and the chances to successfully fight so-called hate speech, is to a great extent is a result of a failure in our common European media policy. Because the example of Hungary, let's forget about Hungary, let's think it's another country with such a crisis right now. Do we have some strong instruments in terms of European media policy in hands to tell that country, whatever member state would that be, that a supermajority in parliament, which importantly, but it's not necessarily part of the picture I just mentioned, that you know the context better, placed together with the extreme right, but I mentioned that just in brackets. So what can we do if in any member states such a supermajority, or maybe just a single majority, fully takes over the body that is deciding about licenses, as Amy described? Right now, in Europe, our common European media policies do not have a word on that. I mean, do not have an effective word. We cannot say that you are violating this rule. The European Commission failed to propose successfully in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive a binding mandatory rule that would have made it impossible for the Hungarian government to create such a media council. And so my question is that, do you see some chance to use either the common European policies on media pluralism or other related policies, including a possible amendment of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive to have such a mandatory provision in it, which would require member states to respect the sufficient independence of the media councils? So do you see some ways to do something about it, or we have this all fancy sounding policies, but if whatever member states go Putinized, then we just look the other way? Thanks.
Thank you. Oreste, please.
Thank you very much. Only a brief question, not only looking back at the past, but looking at the future. A question addressed to Amy, that as perhaps it's well known, she ran a really important studies on comparative aspect of media laws that I think should be shared among us. My question is, this study, together with the decision of Constitutional Court, put under a kind of pressure the Hungarian government. Now, they have 4 months, a little bit less, to change something of this law. My question is on 2 dimensions. Which could be the methodological approach that is best, that could be best suited to achieve the goal or make the Hungarian media law coming back to, let's say, constitutional common tradition in Europe? The second one is the content. Which could be the change that, in your opinion, could be really done at this moment, and which could be instead something that we should, in a way, postpone to another season? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Jean-Paul, please.
Yes, 2 quick questions. One on the indicators, PEGI indicators. I mean, the question of ownership. Do you study as well, in terms of ownership, the fact that media owners not only, well, sometimes they do compete among media owners, but at the same time, some of those media owners do cooperate in other economic sectors, which creates, I mean, another level of complacency or complicity among those media owners. And I have to say, as a former editor-in-chief of a couple of media, I mean, I have to say the major pressure that I had been under is really the fact that some of the owners have activities in other fields than the media, and they really clearly tell you, as if you're an editor-in-chief, you know, you don't touch that company, or you don't cover that issue because we have interest in it. If you take France, for instance, you have major media companies that are owned by arms manufacturers or plane manufacturers. I can tell you that it can make a difference when you have to cover foreign news. This is one question concerning media pluralism. Behind it, there's a question of the I would say the conglomerization of ownership, which really raises big issues for independence of journalists. And the second is a question, we have no one from the European Broadcasting Union here, but I'm very surprised that in Europe, I mean, we have many public broadcasters that don't seem to be held by the standards that EBU, I mean, is premised upon, which means really all the standards and norms of public broadcasting in the highest definition of what it means. It's weird to see that We don't have, I mean, I would love to hear from EBU how they deal with those kinds of public broadcasters that seem to, it was outrageous what we heard about some public broadcaster and the unbalanced coverage, even racist coverage in Hungary. I mean, does it make sense? So if someone knows about how the EBU works, I think it would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank, please.
Yeah, two questions. It seems to me that we're going, in a way, in this conversation on pluralism, back to the debate of how much is media suffering from the over-commercialization as a perspective. If it is only seen as a business, as a commercial enterprise, obviously that will lead them to not necessarily high-quality coverage, but coverage that sells. Either propaganda, as was said in the example of Hungary, or light-minded coverage for entertainment that doesn't inform serious debate and with a pluralistic perspective. So it seems to me that the key question is, where are we going in terms of the view that media has of itself? And in all those excellent research that you have all done, that I was really very impressed, is that question being put forward to the owners of the media. This goes in hand with the last question. It makes a big difference to find out if the owners of media also happen to be owners of arms factories, obviously their coverage of wars in the world or Syria will be different than if they're not. Let me explain that with an example of my own country. The media in general is taking sides with the international mining industry, because they have discovered gold recently, tragically. So that where the mining industry is where the money is. So they're all supporting the mining industry, and now all of a sudden they're criticizing the local Mayan social movements, indigenous movements, because they're raising the consultation of Convention 169 of the ILO, and they're even being called terrorists. So now if you're an indigenous person and you're raising your voice against a mining company and the destruction of the atmosphere, of the environment, you turn out to be a terrorist. Clearly the economic interest, and one of them is even worse. One of them is the owner of the biggest network of radio stations, but his son is also the Minister of Mining and Energy in the country. So the connection is even clearer. But it's like, for them, it's no big deal. They're covering news. And I think this is crucial. And secondly, in terms of the division of public broadcasting and other forms of broadcasting, like community broadcasting, if only the commercial perspective is prevailing, then we're kind of doomed, because local community broadcasting will not be interesting because it's non-profit, and public broadcasting will only be interesting if it is government controlled, which is not the type of public broadcasting we want. We want independent public broadcasting. So how to save the day? I don't know if you all know, in Argentina, it's interesting, they passed a law about 2 years ago. I was there, dividing the spectrum exactly in 3 parts, not as a goal, but as a limit, a maximum. 33.3% of the frequencies had to be community broadcasting, a third could be commercial, and a third had to be public service of any public institution, universities or other sectors for educational purposes. People criticized this law very much because they said it was violating the principle of free press. But in reality, what it was putting a limit to free enterprise, in the sense that not all the spectrum had to be commercial. So I wonder whether in Europe some debate of this nature has been. This is already an active legislation in Argentina. Uruguay is doing the same. They're about to pass this law. I would wonder whether in Europe there's this type of debate on legislation. Since Europe is actually the example for good public independent broadcasting, as I mentioned yesterday. And the final question is, we always discuss freedom of the press specifically and the role of media vis-a-vis the government. And obviously my role is precisely that, is to oppose any form of censorship from the government and no intervention from especially the executive branch of governments in the content of media at all, except in those clearly defined issues of law and those prohibitions established by law that we were mentioning yesterday in terms of hate speech. But has anyone talked about the opposite side of the coin? If the media also is the exercise of a right by society to be well informed, was pluralism, why not throw the debate back to society and have media deal with society? I love the experience of The Guardian that was mentioned yesterday. I honestly haven't heard of open journalism in that way anywhere else in the world. And I think this is a good practice, which I plan to quote in my reports. But what about that? What about making journalism clearly and publicly accountable to society by opening a debate, not necessarily by establishing a mechanism of verification, but just having an open debate with society of the quality of the coverage? Thank you.
After the last question from Milika, and then we will have from 5 to 10 minutes to answer all the questions.
A comment related to commercialization of the media, particularly in Southeast Europe and some East European countries. Our experience is that the era of investing in media as the way of, as a prestige thing, or cleansing guilty conscience in Southeast Europe after the war is over. They invested money in churches for guilty conscience, and they don't want to be commercial. Question for Mark. Mark, when you talked about diversifying sources, I couldn't get exactly when you said your monitors are local. Was it a compliment or criticism? And I'm asking just because, as you know, we do studies and monitoring in the regions where we work, and what we have found out, for instance, in South Caucasus, when we did 2 years monitoring, even though you train your monitors, you instruct them, you give definitions or terms and things like that, somehow our monitor in Azerbaijan couldn't find a single nationalistic piece of journalism in 2 years. And we know all what's been happening in Azerbaijan. So why did you say they're local and, this? Thank you.
So thank you very much for your questions and comments. So who wants to start? There's a lot of questions. Mark?
Thank you. Well, using local expertise is what we do. I mean, it's how we operate, and it's challenging in some ways. In some of the countries we're trying to do this project in, we have really looked. We are asking local media researchers to do work of a kind they've never done before and have no experience of. So there's a good deal of mentoring has been required, and in a few countries we've actually not been able to pursue the project. So it's very challenging, and it also involves immense editorial input, but it's the way we do it, and we think that it's worth doing. There's also a capacity building aspect to this whole project, which is very much in line with broader Open Society Foundation's projects. And we work with the local foundations and with local partner NGOs to try to set up a system, a structure in country which can deliver a report of adequate quality. So that's how we do it. And broadly, it's a good thing, but it's practically sometimes challenging. On Aidan's question about public service media, public service values and so forth, I mean, as you know, Aidan, the public service media, by and large, losing news audiences faster than their commercial rivals, by and large, and especially among young people. We all, I'm sure, have examples from our own experience of how public service media do not matter to young people. They're growing up without them, without that experience. And we do not know how that is going to shape the future in respect of the sort of viability of public service media at all. Of course, it's extremely difficult to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's very hard for these institutions to overhaul themselves in the midst of a communications revolution. I mean, it's our impression that where the public service broadcasters were fit for purpose before digitization hit them, they've been able to rise to the challenge broadly in northwestern Europe. And where they weren't fit for purpose, they still aren't. And the gap is widening between the two, I would say. Where genuine PSB is embedded in society, then it's doing quite well. And my own sense is that in northwestern Europe, these institutions are more solidly placed now. They're in a better fettle now than they would have expected 5 or 10 years ago. Elsewhere, they're falling off a cliff, and they're they're all tangled up in their vicious circles of professional resignation, political control, underinvestment, public indifference, if they're lucky, public hostility in many cases. So it's no, we don't pick up a sense of a renewal of public service, of the public service mission. Indeed, that phrase has a very old-fashioned ring about it, and that, as you know, is part of the problem. I think that's all for me.
Perhaps I'll start with Mr. Marteau's question with regard to horizontal concentration of, or diagonal actually, concentration of ownership in media on the one hand and other strategic sectors on the other hand. We did look into that, and we developed an indicator which was, however, put to what we call the second tier level. So the report also describes a number of indicators that were initially envisaged, but then after passing or adopting the SMART test were not included in the first tier indicators in the Excel file. The reason was, and I am turning to Robert Picard's experience here, the reason was that there is no empirical evidence of how did he phrase it? There is no automatic negative impact of owning, in all cases, of owning assets both in the media and in other sectors, because, according to him, there's not enough empirical evidence to automatically assume that if you also own assets in different sectors, as a media owner, that has a negative impact on the diversity of the media products. And therefore, because of this lack of direct relationship, we put it into the second tier level, but we did look into it. Then perhaps in response to Mr. Laroux's remark on the Argentinian Act, which has divided spectrum into 3 parts, in our tool, we also have certain indicators on community media, and part of one of the indicators looks at the regulatory framework, and does the regulatory framework reserve a certain amount of spectrum for community media. So as I said, our study is not about imposing certain policies. We don't prescribe that the European member states should reserve part of the spectrum for community media, but it is in the indicators. So countries who do it will score better. And there's also, of course, the resolution and the MICO report. No, it's not the MICO report. It's not a report by the European Parliament on community media, adopted 3 years ago. And with regard to Mr. Aidan White's question, is the tool, or is your disappointment related to the fact that the tool is now outdated? I have to acknowledge that perhaps in some respect, in some regard, but certainly not completely, and I think the majority still stands. The methods, the systematics behind it are still valid for 2 reasons actually, because we took a forward-looking approach back then, and we do have certain indicators on what you would call the new media, looking at concentration in internet content provision, looking at is there an active blogosphere who can provide an alternative to traditional media. So we do have those indicators already in the tool today. And the second reason is that a lot of the discussions we had 3-4 years ago are still taking place. I'll give you an example. We thought about search engines, the impact of search media on diversity. I saw that Marco, he left the room, but the man from Google, but I guess he would agree that the impact is still not, or there is not, right now, not enough empirical evidence to conclude that search engines do have either a positive or negative impact on the diversity. You have, of course, the speech of Elie Pariser on the information bubble, but at the same time, he's heavily criticized by other people. I was at a PhD defense last week in Amsterdam, someone who made a PhD on search media freedom, and part of the PhD was on diversity, and he also comes to the conclusion we don't have enough empirical evidence to conclude that the impact is either positive or negative. So still today, there would be no method to include or measure an indicator on search media with regard to media diversity. Also the report, the Ofcom report on the media plurality test, the News Corp BSkyB merger, they did look into things like multi-sourcing. People do consult different sources online. What impact does that have on the diversity of their news consumption? And they also had to conclude that there's not enough, there are no methodologies at hand or readily available, and there's no evidence to try to take that into account. So still today, we would not be able to solve or translate that into concrete indicators. So it's certainly not outdated. It's, I think it's high time to have a debate and try to move research a bit further. That's also the reason why on the 27th of June, and you're all cordially invited, we're going to have a major conference in the European Parliament, in the Hemicycle Debating Chamber, on media pluralism and new media. And we hope to, well, have also those discussions there. Thank you. May I take advantage of the situation that I was going to say we have 1 minute, but I wanted to give the floor to Peter for just 1 minute, because he prepared something. He wanted to, Peter, are you? Yes. It's only 2 minutes before the coffee break. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy, and this would be a short special contribution, because what I stressed that I think it's a cultural matter what we are talking about, and enabling environment requires fighting prejudices and ignorance, and I think we need art for that. So I just want to read a short poem to you which I wrote in New York and presented at several conferences as an example. I wrote it from the viewpoint of a woman, and one of the 7 dirty words will be included, so please don't be shocked. So here it is, it's really short. The leaves on beautiful trees. Hear me, my love, it's so much easier to write about love than about hate. Do you think that a warm smile can shine through prejudice and hate? You say that you cannot tell your parents that you are dating me because I am liberal. Could you tell them that I am a gypsy or Jew? Could you tell them that I am a Muslim? What would they say if I had brown or black skin? What would they say if I were an atheist? What would they say if I had a nose so much different from yours? Would your people punish you more for our sacred love if you were a girl? Would they burn you as a witch? Would they cut your hair or stone you to death? What would your people do to you if you were gay? My people, I'm not sure about my people. When you say it's so human, you mean hatred of the other, you mean cruelty and darkness, you mean fear of freedom? Or you mean sharing respect, you mean learning from the other, you mean joyful light, you mean freedom from fear? What would they say if they knew that we made love? What would they say if they knew that I wanted you to fuck me? what would they say if they saw that we are so different? Would they understand that we are the same as the water in the river and the leaves on beautiful trees, as people on the New York subway? What would they think and what would they say? Thank you.